This video is a second part to the Chimera Ant Arc video that I had uploaded earlier to my channel, so definitely watch that video before continuing with this one. This is the 6th video in a series of videos where I've been analysing the entire story of Hunter x Hunter. In my first Chimera Ant Arc video, I analysed and discussed Gon and Meruem's character extensively. In this video, I'll be discussing some of the other characters which feature within this arc, as well as analysing and breaking down aspects of the story which I didn't mention in the first video. Even after going through the entirety of the Hunter x Hunter story, I still believe the Chimera Ant Arc to be my favourite story arc of the series, and it continues to add further details to concepts that have been introduced in the series like Nen. In addition to this, the Chimera Ant Arc is very unpredictable. Some of the events that occur totally catch me off guard. This arc has several different phases, beginning with the Queen Chimera Ant building her army by devouring humans, and then after Kite's death, Gon and Killua returning to train again with Bisky, and ultimately prove themselves to Knuckle and Shoot before they are allowed to join the Chimera Ant extermination team. And lastly, wrapping up with the palace invasion, which ultimately leads to the defeat of Meruem and the Chimera Ants. So let's now break down and analyse these various different portions of this arc, while also paying particular attention to any characters that I didn't discuss or talk about in my first Chimera Ant Arc video. The Chimera Ant Arc is the longest story arc to feature within Hunter x Hunter. It spans a total of 132 chapters. The way that it was serialized is probably the reason why the 1999 anime did not adapt this arc. This is because the first chapter of the Chimera Ant Arc, chapter 186, was published in June 2003, and the final chapter of this arc, chapter 318, was published in October 2011. The reason why this arc took 8 long years to complete was because of Togashi's hiatuses, which are credited to his failing health. In the first video of the Chimera Ant Arc, I discussed the duality between Meruem and Gon, describing how Meruem had slowly been able to gain his humanity, while at the same time Gon loses his humanity. I didn't speak much about the chairman of the Hunter Association, Isaac Netero, and how he was put in a very difficult position and had to improvise, while having no support from the Hunter Association or the V5. This further adds to the discussions of humanity, through how uncooperative the Hunter Association and the V5 were towards the threat of the Chimera Ants, which ultimately places Netro in a very difficult situation, which not only involves the political sphere of the Hunter x Hunter world, but also puts at risk the existence of the Hunter Association through his position as its chairman. Under normal circumstances, a character who saves humanity would be celebrated, but the way that Togashi unfolds the circumstances and the variables which are associated with it result in Netro being in a dilemma where he could be discredited for saving humanity. And this is even assuming if Netro will even survive his encounter with the Chimera Ants and their king. Very simplistic and surface level assessments of Netero's actions during the Chimera Ant Arc associate him to some kind of a monster, even going as far as to describe Netero's actions as cruel. The fact of the matter is, Netro wasn't a hero, nor did he ever try to be, but he did sacrifice his own life in order to kill Meruem and the rest of the Chimera Ants. If you have read and paid attention to the subtle nuances of this arc, then you will know that Netero did not go through all of this effort just so that he could fight an incredibly strong opponent. He had no desire to fight Meruem, or even the royal guards for that matter. When he first sees Pito, Morel even says to him whether if they should fight Pito, but he refuses to. Instead, he focuses their efforts on destroying the different squadrons and their groups, slowly whittling down the Chimera Ants via a well thought out tactical approach, which allows Netero to practice his abilities against the Chimera Ants that are being teleported to him, as well as giving him ample time in order to meditate and to become stronger. When the threat of the Chimera Ants is made known to the main leaders of the world, who are represented by the V5 organization, they hire Netero to eradicate the threat of the ants by any means necessary, knowing that the palace would have tens of thousands of civilians, as well as being aware that the other hunters would also be present to launch their counterattack against the Chimera Ants. The V5 had no issue with throwing the Hunter Association under the bus by suggesting that even a genocide is appropriate as long as the threat of the Chimera Ants is eradicated. We learn about this in chapter 288 when Netero has a flashback to when he was assigned the mission by the 5v5. Instead of preparing their militaries, they hire a lone hunter to deal with the issue, knowing that there have been hundreds or if not thousands of casualties at the hands of the ants. They burden the task of killing the ants with Netero, and order that he kills them as quickly as possible. He is granted permission to complete this task by any means necessary. In hindsight, knowing that Netero activated the poor man's rose, it is jaw-dropping to see the leaders of the world give complete permission to launch a nuclear attack upon thousands of innocent people. And this is where you call into question the humanity of the people who are leading the world. If it wasn't for Netero taking the initiative to hire Zeno, and through using his ability Dragon's Head taking himself and Meruem to a faraway location where military equipment is tested, then the poor man's rose would have detonated within the palace, killing thousands of individuals, and thus through Netero's actions, the reputation of the Hunter Association is called into question, as well as the murder of countless innocent people, all to get rid of a threat that most of the world doesn't even know about. Only the select few individuals who are leading the world know about this threat. So imagine when the rest of the world finds out that the chairman of the Hunter Association launched a nuke which ended up killing so many people, but it was for the sake of killing man-eating ants. But the funny thing is, there is no evidence of these man-eating ants even existing because they were all blown to smithereens. Nobody will believe this story, which would result in Netro not being celebrated but vilified. Just remember, before he even went to the battlefield, the man placed a bomb within himself. He was ready and willing to give his own life. This wasn't a quest to fight a strong opponent and to test the results of his training. This was a do-or-die mission. When he was first assigned the task to kill the ants, he didn't know that they could use Nen. Meruem wasn't born, nor were any of the 3 royal guards, so the measures that he initially takes to defeat the Chimera ants isn't as excessive as his later measures. His first real description of someone who has actually faced off against a Chimera ant is from Killua. He reveals to Nov, Morel, and Netero that one of the Chimera ants could use Nen. He describes Pito's Nen as being malicious, and far more sinister than anyone else that he has ever met. The maliciousness of Pito's aura exceeded Illumi's and even Hisoka's. Killua, who knows Nen himself and can assess the strength of other Nen users, states that despite Nov, Morel, and Netero being strong, they are nowhere near strong enough to face off against Pito. But Nov and Morel take no heed of Killua's warning. They simply assume that Killua must be overestimating his opponent. In response to this, Netero behaves more maturely, as he states that the threat of the Chimera ants puts the survival of humanity at risk. At all costs, he says that he must do what he can in order to stop this crisis from worsening. If they do not tackle the Chimera ants with all of the strength that they have, then they will risk being assimilated with them. Netero here states that if they do not defeat the Chimera ants, then they will be eaten by them, and thus risk handing over all of the information that is stored within their brains of their experiences of learning about Nen to make the ants evolve and become stronger. So it is for this reason that only small groups are going into the NGL to investigate the Chimera ants. And you could even say this is why Netero doesn't want to hire so many different hunters to go and assist him, because if even one hunter who knows how to use Nen is captured by them, then they can learn everything that they need to know about Nen through this individual. So it is for tactical reasons that they are keeping their numbers small for now. But they are unaware that the hunter that we had seen earlier in the Hunter Exam arc, Pokol, has already been captured by the Chimera ants, and he has divulged all the information that he knows about Nen to them. Netro states that only a select few will be able to face off against the Chimera ants, and Gon and Killua do not meet this requirement, and it's for this reason that he had arranged for 2 assassins in the nearest city as opponents for them to overcome. He hands Killua 2 tokens for him to present to the hunters, and orders both him and Killua to take out these 2 assassins. If they cannot do this, then they are not worthy enough or strong enough to help Netero and the others. The fact that Netero was carrying these 2 tokens and arranged for the 2 assassins to be in the nearest city means that he knew that Killua and Gon would fail, but at the same time he wants to give them a chance. And through this very brief moment, we learn why Netero didn't enlist the help of other hunters aside from Nov and Morel. The 3 of them were strong enough to assess the threat of the Chimera ants, at least to the extent of knowledge that he had about them at the time, which was prior to the birth of the royal guards and even the king. As we learn later, his plan to eradicate the Chimera ants completely changes once he is able to feel Pito's sinister aura for himself. In chapter 234, we learn about some plot points which set up the next arc of the series, as well as revealing to us the relationship that Netero has with the Hunter Association despite being its chairman. We learn that the Hunter Association made it difficult for him to even hire Nov and Morel to assist him in this mission, and any additional hunters that they requested for were not provided, needed. Instead, weaker temporary hunters were given. You can assume that the Hunter Association and the people who are on its board wanted Netro to fail, and this presumably stems from the individual who wants to become the next chair of the Hunter Association. I'm of course talking about Pariston Hill. Nov speculates that the vice chairman Pariston has been bribing the board of the Hunter Association, which is resulting in them giving jobs to hunters who have pledged to vote for Pariston in the next vice chairman election. The evidence to support this is through the squadron leaders that they have tracked down and have requested the Hunter Association to assign hunters to capture them have all been getting away, and this is because the hunters who have been assigned the jobs are supporters of Pariston, who desire for Netero to fail in his mission. If Netero fails this mission, then he will be held responsible for all of the victims that the Chimera Ants are killing. If he doesn't defeat the threat, then he won't be deemed as being suitable for the role of the chairman. What confidence would this instill into other hunters if Netero, their chairman, fails this mission? Just like a real-world politician, Pariston is behaving unethically. He is inadvertently allowing the squadron leaders to escape and thus kill more innocent people, and all the while Netero has been placed into a situation where even if he manages to kill Meruem, then it will be considered a failure because of all of the casualties which will result in the fallout after the defeat of the Chimera Ants. Nov Morel had known this, and so did Netero. He risked his reputation and put everything on the line to come up with this plan to defeat Meruem. They estimate that the unavoidable casualties in order to defeat the king and the Chimera Ants is at least 5 million people, and this is the moral dilemma of Netero's situation, whether if it is justified to kill thousands of people in order to save millions of them. The Chimera Ant Arc excels in discussing the nature of humanity, and it does so by introducing a new species, the Chimera Ants, to the individuality of humans. Like I mentioned in my first video, the second generation of Chimera Ants were born with human traits, and thus developed individuality and egotism. The Chimera Ants end up becoming a reflection of mankind, as we see deplorable actions committed by the Chimera Ants but then are faced with our own tragedies and wrongdoings that humanity has inflicted upon itself. It leads us to conclude that in the end the Chimera Ants and the humans are not so different after all. As a species, humans have always undergone growth and evolution. This can only occur after we let go of who we once were. Learning from our mistakes is an essential part of evolving and growing, and thus every stage of development that has occurred has been as a result of our flaws and our mistakes that we have made. This isn't always the case, but because we make mistakes and we are imperfect, it results in us being able to empathize with others and to grow as a species. Looking back at the many atrocities that mankind has inflicted on its own, you empathize with the victims of humanity's selfishness. Why is it that we live in a world where people have an abundant supply of money, while others don't even have a roof over their head and are starving through poverty and malnutrition? It is because of our flaws that we can reflect upon our actions, and we can see the consequences of our imperfections on the lives of others, and this leads us to being generous and empathetic. But at the same time, it is our very flaws and imperfections which lead us to committing these atrocities in the first place, out of egotism and selfishness, which are the very personality traits that the Chimera Ants have learned through assimilating with humans. But at the same time, good did occur through assimilation with humans, as Meruem was able to develop humanity, and at the end of the arc he had spent his dying moments with the one person that he had fallen in love with. But on the other hand, Gon had given in to his emotions, to the degree of sabotaging himself. He ultimately regresses as a character, all for the sole purpose of revenge. Through the protagonist and the antagonist of this arc, we can see the mirrored dichotomy of humanity. In chapter 215, Netro learns about the birth of the king Meruem, and he asks Kot to compare his strength to the king's strength, considering he has been in the presence of the king. Despite displaying an immense amount of aura, Kot states that he would not even be able to touch the king, because at his current state of power he will be killed by one of the royal guards. Netro smiles at the prospect of a challenge that he may not be able to overcome. At this point, you can assume that Netro has decided that he is not strong enough to defeat Meruem, and his decision to place the poor man's rose into himself has been solidified, as he states that he is going to see an old friend. In order to prevent mass casualties occurring at the palace, he enlists the help of the Zodics, in particular Killua's grandfather Zeno. Netro had planned for the palace invasion to occur so that the hunters that he has enlisted to help him can split up all of the royal guards so that he can be left to battle the king on his own. Considering Netro isn't even strong enough to defeat a royal guard, and you compare the strengths of the other people who had accompanied him to the palace invasion, you can assume that all of these hunters, including Gon and Killua, had invaded the palace knowing that they may never return from this encounter, considering the overwhelming threat that was presented to them. The ultimate goal of the palace invasion for Netro is to kill Meruem. Netro exudes an aura of confidence during his encounter with Meruem because he knows now that he has separated the king from the royal guards and is fighting at an appropriate distance away from the millions of people who may have been a casualty to the poor man's rose. Even if the explosion from the detonation doesn't kill Meruem, then the poison emitted from the poor man's rose will surely kill him. He also knows that if anything were to happen to the king, then this would summon the presence of the other royal guards, who would be exposed to the poison which is still emitting from the corpse of Meruem. Netro's plan is successful, as Puff and Yuppie were exposed to the poison through Meruem's body, and as a result they ended up dying along with Meruem. The only unfortunate casualty to Netero's poor man's rose is Komugi, who ends up dying out of her own choice, in order to spend her dying moments with Meruem. 5 million people would have died if Netro didn't make the necessary preparations to take out Meruem. This also would have been the case if Netro and the other hunters would have failed in their task to defeat the Chimera Ants, as on selection day 99% of the citizens would have died after forcibly initiating their nen. In chapter 251 we learn about how the Chimera Ants are sorting through 500,000 people per day with a 1% survival rate. They have currently sorted 5,000 people who have successfully initiated their nen. They are being stored in human cocoons waiting to be hatched into nen weapons. Meruem will use these against mankind as his pawns, and most likely they will be controlled by Pito's nen. If Netro and the other hunters' plans had failed, then Meruem and his army of controlled nen users would have invaded the rest of the world. I've mentioned all of this to disprove the notion that Netero was wrong in his encounter against Meruem. It is easy to state that Netero was cruel or even selfish with desiring to fight Meruem, especially when Meruem just wanted to sit and exchange words. But after all of this, you understand that a lot was on the line for Netero. Meruem as a character was seeking identity and to learn more about himself. He was struggling between his human side and his Chimera Ant side. After learning and gaining some humanity through his interactions with Komugi and Netero, Meruem decides that he isn't going to kill all of humanity like he had planned, but instead he is going to rule over them as a fair and just king, and he will only kill a select few who he deems unworthy of living. Meruem has become more humane, but it isn't a complete 180 change. It's because his actions when he first appeared were so polarizing and so far from humanity that when he shows even a glimpse of humanity, it feels like a total change in his character. He is still far from being a good person, and this is why Netero must defeat him. It is not for the sake of Netero wanting to fight a strong opponent, but it is rather for the survival of humanity. He only behaves the way that he does after the poor man's rose is detonated because he knows that he is dying, so he sees no point in continuing on with his ambitions, so instead he decides to spend his final moments with the one person that he loves. Even if Netero were to have sat down and exchanged words with Meruem, there is no way that he could have convinced him not to enslave the human race. This is ultimately a struggle for power. When the world leaders were threatened by the existence of the Chimera Ants, they hired Netero as a glorified exterminator to get rid of the pests. The battle between Netero and Meruem begins in chapter 287 and concludes in chapter 298. It begins with Meruem telling Netero that he doesn't stand a chance, and there is really no need for him to hurry towards his death. He says this not because he is underestimating him like Netero assumes, but rather because he knows that Netero is aware of this fact. Meruem even tells him that it is counterintuitive for him to fight for the sake of humanity. The world is being run by selfish individuals who have partitioned it into several different borders. He describes that on the border to the right hand side, children are starving to their death, while on the borders to the left hand side, idle leaders are feasting with excess. Meruem describes this as madness, and I totally agree with him, but it is the way that he wants to enact change onto the world that I disagree with. He states that he will destroy all of the borders and create an equal world, a world where nobody is living to excess. Meruem describes his plans to Netero. He has incredible power and he has learnt what this power should be used for. He decides that it is there to protect the weak who deserve to live, and it doesn't exist to oppress others, like how the leaders of the world have been oppressing other nations through the threat of nuclear war, by strong-arming their way into positions of power, by instilling fear into their adversaries who dare to oppose the current way of the world. But this isn't the case with Meruem. He has far more power than any of the leaders of the world, and he wants to use this power to bring about a somewhat positive change to the world. Netro even states that this is quite a situation, as he can see that Meruem is wavering between his human side and his ant side. Netro states that he has to choose between one of them. Meruem objects to fighting Netero, and he says that he will stay in this spot and sit down and debate with him. His human side is depicted through Netro seeing Meruem hold on to a injured Komugi, who is damaged by the dragon dive ability that was unleashed earlier. He is shocked to see this monster being concerned and caring for the life of a frail girl, while on the other hand, his monstrous side is depicted through when he had eaten the flesh of a child. But regardless of the side that Meruem eventually settles upon, it doesn't matter. It doesn't change the task that Netero has come here to do. He has been ordered to exterminate and destroy the ants. So before his heart starts to waver due to Meruem actually speaking sense, he decides to begin their battle. While he is sat down, Netero attacks him with his 100 type Guanyin Bodhisattva Nen ability. He strikes him with the first hand. Despite his attack being a direct hit, it only causes Meruem to spit out some blood. Meruem still wants to sit down and talk with Netero, but this time Netero strikes him with the third hand. But its attack is blocked by Meruem, and he expresses its anger through his Ren. Through this display of Ren, he demonstrates a small portion of his aura, but it is enough for Netro to double the distance that he usually retreats. Netro's persistence and his determination to battle Meruem was brushed aside so easily, as if he was ironically an ant. Meruem still wants to exchange words, but Netro is frustrated because the king is in no position to negotiate with him. But that's when Netro realizes that he can persuade Meruem to fight through words, by stating that he knows the king's name. He states that if the king can make Netro admit defeat, then he will tell him his name. Finally, in chapter 290, Meruem agrees to fight, but only enough to satisfy him. He will not go all out in order to kill Netero. It may appear that Meruem is underestimating Netro, as he says that it's not going to take him too long, but this really isn't the case. Meruem is so incredibly powerful. It's like Togashi inverted the relationship between actual size ants and humans in this character called Meruem. The best way to describe it is placing Netro in the position of the small ant, and with Meruem being in the position of the human who is about to crush the ant with his oversized foot. Because of Netro's incredible strength, he had usually waited for the opponent to make the first move, but for the first time in a long while, he charges towards Meruem after gaining his approval to fight. Netro immediately unleashes the 99th hand, an ability which reminds me of Jotaro's stand ability from JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. During this battle, Netro actually realizes that it became routine procedure for him to shake the hand of the loser and to accept their gratitude for teaching them a lesson. But this is not the outcome of a battle that he had wanted after hours upon hours of training. He realizes that he instead had dreamed to actually give his heart and soul to a battle against an unstoppable adversary. You can say that Netro's pursuit of growth and evolution was stunted because he couldn't find someone worthy enough to fight against. He didn't go into this battle having realized this. He realized this during his battle with Meruem. He initially fought against Meruem because he was a threat to the survival of humanity, and primarily because Netro was ordered by the world leaders to kill Meruem. But indirectly through this battle, Netro has finally found what he was looking for. Eventually the two of them fall beneath the ground into an underground structure, which Netro describes as Meruem's grave. At the end of chapter 291, Netro expresses his gratitude, as he states that he is lucky and thankful for everything that has led him to this point. All of the events that have occurred that have ultimately led him to this fight against Meruem. The two of them begin to exchange back and forth attacks, with Netro successfully maintaining the distance between himself and the king whenever the king would try to get close enough to him. Meruem could barely follow the after images that Netro was producing. It had left Meruem feeling admiration for his enemy. Despite all of the attacks that Netro had unleashed upon Meruem, they had no effect on him. Meruem tells Netro that he is a rare example of a human who has transcended beyond his limits, and he has done so through effort alone. He commends Netro, but Netro responds with anger. You could say that Netro's pride is angered here, and his feelings of superiority have been crushed by Meruem. He even angrily states to himself that Meruem thinks that he is so far above the rest of humanity, but instead he is just a smug little insect. Netro continues to attack Meruem while Meruem continues to close the distance between the two of them as he wants to engage in close combat, but every time he manages to close the distance he is smacked away by Netro's ability. Netro's 100 type Bodhisattva is the only ability that he has that can surpass Meruem's speed, but the king isn't concerned by this because the ability actually does little to no damage to him. Meruem begins to enjoy his battle against the chairman, as he starts to treat it like one of his board games, trying to tactically come up with a strategy to defeat his opponent. It appears that not only is Meruem enjoying the battle, so is Netero. The battle between the two of them, as Netero describes, is a battle of endurance and concentration. Any lapse of judgment from either of them will result in their bodies being torn limb from limb. This results in Netero feeling a constant pressure to perform at his best. He will try to prolong the fight as long as he can until he has exhausted all of his options, and then at that point Netero states that Meruem will meet his end. Netero sadistically smiles as he is taunting the king to try and checkmate him, but in retaliation he has yet to show him his ability called the Zero Hand. After exchanging thousands of attacks with each other, Meruem started to feel a dull internal ache. That is until Netero's right leg has been completely severed. Meruem was able to sneak past the arms of Netero's Nen ability. He believes that he has done enough to satisfy Netero's urge to battle. He tells him to stop the bleeding through his leg and to tell him his name. It appears that this is the end of the battle, as he says that he has done well for a human. Meruem says that it was inevitable that Netro would have been striked by one of his attacks, because his attacks are flawless, but Netero's defenses are not perfect. He credits his foresight to his games that he has played with Komugi. Meruem states that next he will target Netero's left arm, and at this point Netero realizes that this is probably the last moments of his life. The exchange of blows that occurs next is so incredibly fast that it occurs in less than a minute. The blows that they exchange within this short period of time had exceeded over 1,000. This continues until Meruem is able to deduce the flaws in Netero's moves. He finds a slight bias in the way that Netro is exhibiting his offensive style. He attributes this way of attacking to habitual behavior. It is through this habitual behavior and this bias which exists within Netro's abilities that he is able to find a weak spot. He capitalizes upon this and is able to once again slip through the Nen aura arms that Netro has constructed, and this time he fulfills his promise of severing Netro's left arm. It is at this point when Netro unleashes his final ability, Zero Hand. In this one final attack, Netro focuses every last ounce of his aura. It is described as a merciless roar emitting from a merciful goddess. Predictably, it is evident that not even this ability is able to injure Meruem. This attack drains Netro of all of the energy that he has, and he appears to be incredibly frail. Meruem describes the stature between the two of them. He states that he is the future of his species, and on top of this, he is their king, while Netro is one of many. There was no chance for him to win. He states that the entire existence of the Chimera Ant species was focused on its end point of evolution, which was the birth of Meruem, whereas humanity as a species focuses on diversity. Evolution is not focused upon a singular being, but rather on individuals themselves, and it's for this reason that no single individual could have faced off against the peak of evolution and had expected to win. Meruem even realizes that through assimilating humans it disrupts the ants' command structure, as the Chimera ants that are birthed from humans are far more individualistic and do not work for the betterment of the colony. It appears that Meruem is continuing to underestimate the persistence for survival that humans have. Despite using up all of his aura, it appears that Netro still has one last thing left to do. But before this, he reveals to the king that his name in fact is Meruem. Netro, even in his final moments, refuses to succumb to the fear and absolute power of Meruem. He remains defiant, and this shocks Meruem. Netro tells him that he has no idea. Meruem knows nothing of the bottomless malice which exists within the human heart. Even a being as incredibly powerful as Meruem is able to feel the fear behind these words. Meruem, who is at the peak of his existence and his youth, is made to feel fear by an old man who is frail and has nothing left to live for, and in his final moments, Netro's facial expressions exhibit this bottomless malice which Netro had just described. Netro pierces his own heart, stopping it from beating. It is revealed that when his heart stops beating, the poor man's rose, the bomb within his body, will detonate. The poor man's rose is described as a chemical explosive weapon of mass destruction, and it is one of the most dangerous and powerful weapons to exist within the world. The bomb is small, cheap, but lethal. Once it was developed, it was mass produced across the world, and ironically, after the bomb is detonated, the mushroom cloud forms into the shape of a rose, which strangely symbolizes beauty after destruction. Togashi explains in chapter 298 that the poor man's rose had been detonated over 10 times, and it has taken the lives of over 5 million people. This is approximately the same number of lives that the Chimera ants were willing to kill during their selection. Eventually, an international treaty was established to ban the production of the poor man's rose, but 80% of the countries had refused to get rid of their bombs or to ban the use of detonating existing roses. Years later, there still remain hundreds of thousands of poor man's roses waiting to be detonated, and it is here where Togashi draws a parallel between the ants and the humans, stating, were we so different after all? How was it that Netero was not able to consider this question before he detonated the poor man's rose? In the end, humanity exhibits the same level of malice, if not more, than the Chimera ants, especially when it comes to their tendency to hurt other species or even their own kind, all for the sake of survival. I do understand and appreciate that this arc is very divisive amongst fans of the series, as some believe the beginning portions to be really dragged out and slow, as well as being uninteresting, but I personally cannot agree with this. I don't see how the premise of giant man-eating ants being uninteresting. From the very beginning of this arc, I was looking forward to the birth of the king. I was eagerly anticipating the arrival of Meruem, having no idea what he would look like. We were just promised that he would be the peak of the evolutionary chain of the Chimera ants, and this was enough to keep me captivated for the story. As well as this, I was clinging on to some hope that Kite could be revived. That is until I had seen Kite's head on Neferpito's lap, and from this moment onward, I was interested to see how Gon would react after finding out that Kite has indeed died. And this is just a very small example of some of the plot points which kept me invested into the story of this arc. And as you know, the highlights of this arc for me were Gon's confrontation with Neferpito, how Meruem had developed humanity through his relationship with Komugi, how we see the character development of the royal gods, and how each of them react differently to Meruem coming to learn more about the world and humans. But ultimately, all three of them had wanted the best for Meruem. But the difference is each of them have a very different and unique way of serving the king, which is unique to their own mindset. And of course, the battle between Meruem versus Netro, which is easily one of the best anime fights ever. And on top of this, one of the most impactful transformations ever occurs within this arc, seeing Gon transform into his adult form. And through all of these great and epic moments, we get questions of morality morality, and comparisons of how humans are no different to the monsters that they are afraid of, as well as discussions of the lengths that a species will go to in order to survive. One thing that became very evident from my first Hunter x Hunter video was that a lot of people didn't like the presence of the narrator during this arc. I didn't feel like the narrator was interrupting the flow of the story. Some of these events in this arc occur in such a short amount of time that the narrator breaking down and explaining the events that have occurred is better than having no explanation at all. In the end, I feel like the narrator's presence was more impactful to the events that were occurring. I love the moments when the narrator was present, especially during those moments where time had slowed down. It helped to build anticipation and even tension for events that were about to unfold. I am aware that a lot of people didn't like the narrator constantly being there, but I personally enjoyed it a lot. As this arc was unfolding, I began to really like Meruem as a character. As well as this, Netro had become one of my favourite characters in the series after learning more about him from the Chimera Ant Arc. In addition to this, it was devastating to see the bond between Gon and Killua reach its final endpoint during this arc. We have followed these two characters from the very beginning of the series, and here we are forced to see them come to terms with the fact that they are not always going to be there for each other, and for them to now grow as individuals, they need to do that separately. They can no longer rely upon each other, and I feel like this is why Jin didn't want to meet Gon at the end of the Greed Island arc, because Gon was too reliant upon Killua being beside him, but neither of them were aware of this fact. But I feel like the Chimera Ant Arc does well to teach both Gon and Killua that they can grow independently of each other, and this is a risk that most authors aren't willing to take. Togashi stays away from established formulas in order to experiment with his story and to try something different. We see the two of them part their separate ways in the next arc of the story after Gon recovers, and I will talk more about this in my next video, which will cover the 13th Hunter Chairman election arc. I'm incredibly excited to continue my analysis of the Hunter x Hunter story and would love to know your thoughts on the Chimera Ant Arc, so leave your comments under this video and let me know what you enjoyed and what you disliked about this arc. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see more like it, then please consider supporting my channel on Patreon. I have multiple tiers with rewards including access to an exclusive Discord server, video scripts, as well as being the first to know about unreleased upcoming videos. Thank you for your time, and whatever you choose to contribute I will appreciate, and it will mean a lot to me.